Moving on, in this lesson we will pack up what we've done and propagate it over to our leg portion of the mesh. Before we do that, I want to go over something called smart materials. Let's go ahead and put one onto the mesh. They can be found in the shelf under smart materials. And how this differs from standard materials, which if you remember correctly we use for our base metal, is that these include things like dust, grime, and edge wear. As an example, let's drag and drop a painted steel on top of our layer stack. You might be quite amazed and ask yourself, hey, why didn't we just do this to begin with? While these are great starting points as a base for textures, it's always good to understand how these are put together so you can create your own unique look and feel. Let's look further and expand the folder to see how this was put together. Looking at the contents, we have a paint layer, metal details, and a base steel. This setup looks quite familiar to the folders that we set up for our project, so essentially what a smart material is a preset group of folders and layers with applied effects that you can simply drag and drop onto the mesh. And as long as your required maps are baked, which we did in the first module, these smart materials will work. So how do we go about setting up our own smart material? I'll go ahead and delete the steel painted, and we have our base materials already set up. All we have to do is place everything inside of its own folder. So let's create a folder, name it Big I, and drag everything into that folder. I'm just holding down Shift to multiple select several layers. Now, I highly recommend that before we turn this into a smart material, that we are happy with the overall look. It's not really necessary, but it does help solidify all your material settings first. Personally, I'm quite indecisive and always change things. Here, I'll change the base paint roughness to around 0.5 and the height to 0.03. I'll adjust the striping color to more of a tan color. Now, what I'm doing here is actually sampling off an image from my second monitor. So I have the stripe color and glossy paint and the main base color on a swatch. I'll also adjust the height to 0.03. Looking at the paint to metal mask, it's looking a little bit too damaged for me, so I'll push the blur to 0.16, the balance to 0.01, and the contrast to 1. The glossy paint is actually going to be more of a metallic green, so I'll sample the base color off the swatch from my second monitor, change the metallic value to around 0.9, and slide the roughness up to 0.7. The bars will be more of a raw metal, so I'll change the base color to a gray value of around 0.2, enable the metal channel, set that to a value of 1, and the roughness will be at 0.3. And finally, on the dirt group, I'll change the opacity of the overall group to around 50. Now, if you're following along, you don't need to use the values I chose. This is strictly the type of aesthetic that I'm going for. Now that our values are set, we can right-click on the Big I folder and choose Create Smart Material. Now in our shelf, we have our Big I Smart Material. All I have to do is go to the legs texture set. I'll delete this empty layer and simply drag and drop the new smart material onto the layer palette. Now, as this is computing, we'll begin to see a few errors from our smart material. For instance, this thigh guard is the wrong color, and some of this pattern that we painted on is on the wrong spot. Now, before going further, this is a great time to turn on some shadows and just check that your materials are looking the way you want. If they aren't, I do recommend going back to the head texture set, changing the parameters around, and remaking the smart material. In any case, I think this is a good point to end the module. In the next module, we're going to begin by correcting our smart material errors. At the end of this module, you should understand how to quickly assign materials to different parts of the mesh, either using a baked color ID map or the various tools like the polygon fill. Masks are not only used for assigning materials, but can also be used in giving surface detail and variance. Take advantage of the smart mask as a starting point for blending two materials, but always use the paint effect to give it a more handcrafted look. Finally, keep your folders organized and labeled, as putting together a smart material will allow you to quick texture an entirely different part of the mesh simply by dragging and dropping.